One rocket launch to the moon cost $4 billion. And to save millions of people from starvation in Sudan, only $2 billion are needed. While some celebrate a space triumph, entire states are breaking apart here on Earth. Here are the main global events of the past week, based on coverage in European newspapers. The era of illiberal democracy in Hungary has officially come to an end. Péter Magyar's victory and his Tisza party became the biggest triumph for pro-European forces in the past decade, triggering a wave of enthusiastic and cautious reactions in the world press. Last week, all attention was focused on Budapest. In its editorial, Le Monde called the result a democratic awakening of a nation. The paper's journalists note that Magyar's success is not just a change of power, but a psychological break. Quoting one voter, "We are no longer afraid of our own government." The British newspaper The Guardian pays special attention to the winner's personality. In an article titled "From Insider to Regime Gravedigger," it writes that Magyar used Orbán's own weapon against him, populism, but filled it with European meaning. Hungary is returning to Brussels' orbit, and that changes the balance of power across Eastern Europe, the authors conclude. The German weekly Der Spiegel looks further ahead and examines the geopolitical angle. The publication says directly that for Kyiv, this is a second wind. It notes that Hungary will no longer block aid tranches for Ukraine. To quote, "Budapest is ceasing to be Moscow's Trojan horse in the European Union, which effectively deprives the Kremlin of its last reliable ally within Europe's institutions." The response to the Hungarian election also reached Chisinau. The Moldovan outlet Agora sees Magyar's victory as an important signal for the whole region. Its analysts stress that Orbán's defeat undermines pro-Russian forces in Moldova, which often look to the Hungarian model of a special path within Europe. Agora writes, "Hungary's example shows that even the most rigid power vertical cannot withstand society's demand for real European change. For Moldova, this confirms that the path of reform, despite all its difficulties, has no alternative." Italy's Corriere della Sera warns against excessive euphoria. In its commentary, the paper points to the institutional swamp left behind by Orbán. Winning an election is only 10% of the job. The real battle begins when trying to restore independence to the courts and state media, which have spent a decade saturated with Fidesz ideology. Donald Trump carried out his most radical campaign scenario by announcing a naval blockade of Iran. The world has found itself on the edge of a new oil war, and experts are debating whether the global economy can withstand such a shock. In effect, we are seeing a mirror image of the past. For decades, the Strait was a tool of blackmail by Tehran, but now the initiative has been taken over by Washington. In response to the hot phase of Iranian attacks, when missile strikes and drones damaged more than 25 ships, and Iran effectively imposed a $1 million fee for passage, Donald Trump went on the offensive. The United States introduced strict military screening, turning the Navy into a customs service with aircraft carriers. Now, American destroyers, under close watch, are turning away any ships heading to Iranian ports, and in the first days of the blockade, 19 merchant vessels were intercepted this way. The Economist describes Trump's policy as a strategy of maximum risk. The magazine notes that blocking the Strait of Hormuz is an attempt to choke the Iranian economy within months, but the cost of this move may be too high for the United States itself because of the inevitable inflation spike. France's Le Figaro reports the details of the first day of the blockade. U.S. warships have already begun turning back cargo ships flying the Iranian flag. The paper quotes French diplomats. "We are witnessing the collapse of international maritime law in real time. If tomorrow Beijing decides to follow Washington's example in the Taiwan Strait, the world will descend into chaos." Financial Times offers an interesting perspective. It argues that Trump's actions could paradoxically become a catalyst for the green transition. The paper writes, "Energy blackmail by Iran and the harsh U.S. response are forcing Beijing, New Delhi, and Berlin to rethink their strategies. No one wants to depend on a single narrow strait whose fate is decided in the US president's Twitter feed. Relations between the White House and the Holy See have reached the lowest point in history. Open criticism of Pope Leo XIV and Trump's provocative posts have split Catholics around the world, raising the question, where does politics end and messianism begin? The conflict between the two leaders, which began in January with disagreements over Greenland and migration, shifted last week into open information warfare. The trigger was Pope Leo XIV's Sunday sermon, in which the pontiff, the first American pope in history, called for restraint on Iran and condemned the diplomacy of force. Donald Trump's reaction was immediate. As the New York Times reports, the U.S. president's late-night post effectively accused the pontiff of aiding dictators and called him terrible on foreign policy. Trump also said the Pope had been elected only as an American counterweight to his administration, calling him radically left-wing. But the real wave of outrage came after a post on Truth Social. The AI-generated image showed Trump in the likeness of Jesus Christ, healing the sick by laying on hands. Spain's El País devoted its lead spread to the story, calling it the highest form of political narcissism. The paper quotes Latin American bishops. This is not just bad taste, it is a dangerous attempt to replace religion with a cult of personality. We are seeing political marketing turn into open blasphemy. Interestingly, after even Trump's conservative allies, such as activist Sean Foyt, called the image gross sacrilege, the post was deleted. But the explanation that followed shocked the press even more. According to The Guardian, Trump told reporters that he had simply made a mistake. He said, "I thought I was in the image as a Red Cross doctor, just making people healthy. I really am making people better." The paper's commentators note that the ethereal light coming from the president's hands in white robes is hard to confuse with a doctor's coat, and see this as an attempt to save face before his religious voters. The Artemis II mission ended in triumph with the crew's return to Earth. But behind the celebratory headlines lies a deep public divide over whether such spending is justified. The Times ran the headline, "The Moon is Close Again." The paper described the mission's technical success in detail, calling it the decade's greatest achievement, proving that humanity is ready to colonize other worlds. The astronauts' remarks about the fragility of Earth seen from orbit were carried by news agencies around the world. French newspaper Libération took a very different tone. It asks an uncomfortable question. Is one selfie in front of a lunar crater worth ignoring hunger in Africa? The Artemis I and Artemis II missions cost $93 billion, which is comparable to an annual climate change budget. We have learned to fly to the stars, but we still have not learned to feed our neighbors, Libération concludes. Estimates show that just one SLS rocket launch as part of Artemis II cost American taxpayers more than $4 billion, while the SLS rocket itself cost around $2.2 billion. At the same time, up to $2 billion would be enough to address hunger in Sudan, where millions need aid throughout 2026. La Repubblica develops the same idea, noting that the 21st century lunar race is more about prestige and competition with China than real scientific necessity. Space has become a new arena for displays of power, while old conflicts continue to burn on Earth. Sudan stands on the brink of the largest famine in modern history. The international community promised aid in Berlin, but the press doubts that money alone can replace political will. The German press, especially Die Welt, covered the Sudan conference in detail. The paper says the 1.5 billion euros raised by donors is a drop in the ocean. It quotes a Red Cross representative. The problem is not a lack of money, but a lack of access. Food is rotting in ports while generals decide who is more important. Le Monde adds the political context, pointing out that amid the war in Iran and elections in Europe, the Sudan issue is quickly disappearing from front pages. This forgotten war needs not only checks, but also military pressure on the warring sides, and world leaders are clearly not ready for that. While the world's attention is fixed on the Middle East and the Moon, equally dramatic developments are unfolding in Europe, from debates over the boundaries of free speech in Paris to the final suppression of historical memory in Moscow. In France, the political climate has heated up over the so-called Yadon law, which would legally equate denying Israel's right to exist with criminal forms of anti-Semitism and hate. Le Figaro describes the National Assembly debate in detail. Supporters insist that anti-Zionism has become a convenient cover for inciting violence, and argue that the state has an obligation to stop ideological extremism at an early stage. But opponents and human rights advocates, whose concerns are also quoted by the paper, see it as a legal trap in which criticism of the policies or structure of a foreign state is effectively treated as a crime. They warn that such a precedent puts an end to free political debate and turns the courts into tools of censorship, making this an existential test for the legal system of the Fifth Republic. In Ireland, economic frustration spilled onto the roads. Hundreds of tractors blocked Dublin's main arteries in protest against the sharp rise in fuel and fertilizer prices. The Irish Times calls the massive action a collective cry of despair from farmers who have become hostages of global sanctions wars and energy blockades. The paper stresses that current government subsidies are only a bandage on an open wound, and warns that if the situation in the Strait of Hormuz does not stabilize, Ireland's agricultural sector faces a wave of bankruptcies, which would inevitably trigger food shortages and a new round of inflation across Northern Europe. Tragic news came from Russia, where the Supreme Court has finally declared the rights organization Memorial extremist, which Der Spiegel calls the final chord in the liquidation of the remnants of civil society. Journalists stress that banning an organization dedicated to preserving the memory of repression victims symbolizes the Kremlin's final break with European legal tradition, and its shift toward a totalitarian model of managing history. Quoting the Nobel Committee, the publication sums up, "Russian authorities are no longer merely rewriting textbooks, but are legislatively forbidding citizens to remember the tragedies of the past, trying to build the future on a foundation of complete oblivion and the absence of public oversight." You have been watching a weekly review of the world agenda through the eyes of the European press. We appreciate your engagement. Like this video if you found this episode useful, and write in the comments which topic affected you most this week. To understand the context of current events with us, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. You can support our work through the links in the description below this video. Thank you for being with us, and see you next week.